The weight of history. History is often written in ink, but on the morning of June 6, 1944, it was written in blood, oil, and seawater. D-Day was not just a military operation, it was the largest gamble in the history of human conflict, a cross-channel invasion of such magnitude that, had it failed, the liberation of Western Europe might have been delayed by years or halted entirely. To understand D-Day, we must look beyond the landing craft. We must look at the years of desperate planning, the massive industrial output of the Allied nations, and the intricate web of lies to trick a dictator. This is the story of Operation Overlord, the invasion that changed everything. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's Fortress Europe. By 1944, Adolf Hitler's Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, was a reality. Stretching from the North Cape of Norway down to the Spanish border, the Atlantic Wall was a 2,000-mile-long system of coastal defenses. Hitler placed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, in charge of strengthening these defenses. Rommel was a realist. He knew that the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and that the Allied air superiority would make moving reinforcements inland impossible. He famously told his aide, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. The first 24 hours will be the longest day." Rommel oversaw the installation of millions of mines, Czech hedgehogs, and Rommel's asparagus poles, designed to rip the bellies out of Allied gliders. Operation Bodyguard, the Great Deception. The Allies knew they couldn't win by force alone. They needed surprise. But how do you hide an army of 2 million men? You don't. You create a fake one. Operation Bodyguard was the overarching deception plan. Its most famous component, Operation Fortitude South, created the first United States Army Group, FUSAG, under General George S. Patton, based in Kent. FUSAG consisted of inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, and constant radio chatter. The goal was to convince Hitler that the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest distance between England and France. It worked. Even as the real invasion began at Normandy, Hitler held back his powerful Panzer divisions at Calais, convinced the real invasion was still coming. The Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower. The man carrying the weight of the free world was General Dwight Eisenhower. Ike was not a tactical genius in the traditional sense, but he was a master of coalition management. He had to balance the egos of Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and the volatile General Bernard Montgomery. Eisenhower's greatest moment came not on the battlefield, but in a small room in Southwick House. The weather in June 1944 was the worst in 20 years. A storm was raging. His meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, spotted a brief window of better weather. On June 5th, Eisenhower sat in silence for nearly a minute before looking up and saying, "Okay, let's go." The Mulberry Harbours, engineering the impossible. One of the biggest problems the Allies faced was the lack of a deep-water port. Without a port, you cannot land the thousands of tons of supplies needed daily. The solution were the Mulberry Harbours, artificial ports. These were massive, hollow concrete structures, some the size of 5-story buildings, that were towed across the channel and sunk to create breakwaters. It was one of the greatest feats of military engineering in history. Along with PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean to carry fuel, the Allies were bringing their own infrastructure to the fight. The night before, the Airborne drop. Hours before the first boot touched the sand, 24,000 paratroopers and glider-borne infantry dropped into the dark skies over France. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped behind Utah Beach to seize causeways, while the British 6th Airborne dropped to the east to capture the Pegasus Bridge. The drops were a chaotic mess. Pilots, blinded by clouds and heavy flak, dropped men miles from their drop zones. Many paratroopers drowned in flooded marshes, intentionally flooded by Rommel. Yet this chaos worked in the Allies' favor. Scattered small groups of Screaming Eagles and All-Americans attacked German outposts everywhere, creating the illusion of a much larger force and paralyzing the German command. The Pegasus Bridge, the first blood. The very first Allied unit to land in France was a small detachment of the British 2nd Battalion, Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, led by Major John Howard. They arrived via Horsa gliders, landing within meters of their target, the Benneville Bridge, later renamed Pegasus Bridge. In a daring coup de main assault, they captured the bridge in 10 minutes. This prevented German armor from counterattacking the British beaches later that morning. It was the first victory of D-Day, achieved before the sun had even risen.
The Armada, the Channel crossings. As dawn broke, the German defenders on the cliffs of Normandy looked out and saw the impossible. The horizon was filled with ships. This was Operation Neptune, the naval phase of D-Day. Nearly 7,000 vessels were involved. For the young soldiers in the flat-bottomed landing craft, the crossing was a nightmare of seasickness and terror. They were weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, soaked to the bone, and heading toward a wall of fire. Sword Beach, the British landing. At 0725, the British 3rd Infantry Division struck Sword Beach. Their objective was the city of Caen. Unlike the Americans, the British used Hobart's Funnies, specialized tanks designed to clear mines, bridge gaps, and destroy bunkers. On Sword Beach, the piper Bill Millen famously walked the shoreline playing Highland Laddie while bullets whizzed past him. The Germans, thinking he had gone mad, reportedly didn't shoot him. The British successfully linked up with the airborne troops, but the prize of Caen would remain out of reach for weeks. Juno and Gold, the Commonwealth contribution. To the west of Sword lay Gold and Juno beaches. Gold was the responsibility of the 50th British Division, while Juno was the task of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. To continue building toward the 8,000-word target, we now transition from the initial landings into the most harrowing and strategically complex hours of June 6th. These chapters, 11 through 20, focus on the specific tactical struggles of the American sectors and the breakdown of the German High Command. Omaha Beach, the bloody Omaha disaster. If D-Day was a masterpiece of planning, Omaha Beach was where the paint ran dry and the canvas tore. This 4-mile crescent of sand was the most heavily defended sector in Normandy. Unlike the other beaches, the terrain here favored the defender perfectly. The Germans sat in Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, atop high bluffs, looking down onto a flat, open killing field. The disaster began before the troops even hit the sand. Out of 32 DD, duplex drive swimming tanks intended to provide cover for the infantry, 27 sank in the heavy swells, turning into iron coffins for their crews. When the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped at 0630, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Division weren't met by a suppressed enemy, but by a storm of lead. Within minutes, the shoreline was a graveyard of burning steel and shattered men. The plan had completely evaporated. All that remained was the raw will to survive. The 2nd Rangers and the impossible cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. While the carnage unfolded on the beaches, a small group of elite warriors faced a literal uphill battle. 3 companies of the 2nd U.S. Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, were tasked with scaling the 100-foot cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. Intelligence suggested that 6 155mm cannons were stationed there, capable of raining destruction down on both Omaha and Utah beaches. Under constant fire, using rope ladders and fire department extensions, the Rangers clawed their way to the top. When they finally broke into the bunkers, they found a shocking surprise. The guns were gone. They had been moved inland to protect them from bombardment. Undeterred, the Rangers pushed into the nearby orchards, located the hidden guns, and destroyed them with thermite grenades. For 2 days, this small band of men held the heights against fierce German counterattacks, reduced from 225 men to just 90 capable of fighting. Utah Beach, a fortunate mistake. To the far west of the invasion line sat Utah Beach. Here, the story was remarkably different. Due to strong currents, the first waves of the 4th Infantry Division landed 2,000 yards south of their intended target. In military terms, this should have been a crisis. However, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the eldest son of President Teddy Roosevelt, realized the unintended landing zone was actually less defended than the original site. Clumping his cane in the sand, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Because the U.S. paratroopers had successfully seized the causeways behind the beach during the night, the troops at Utah moved inland with relatively light casualties, fewer than 200 men compared to the 2,400 lost at Omaha.
The bunker mentality. Why the Panzers stayed put. One of the greatest what-if questions of D-Day is, where were the German tanks? The 12th SS Panzer Division and the elite Panzer Lehr were stationed just a few hours' drive from the coast. Had they struck the beaches at mid-morning, the Allied foothold might have been crushed. The reason for their absence is a testament to the dysfunction of the Nazi command structure. Hitler was convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion for the real attack at Calais. Because of his obsessive control, the Panzer divisions could only be moved with his personal authorization. On the morning of June 6th, Hitler had taken a sleeping pill and his staff refused to wake him. By the time the Bohemian corporal woke up at noon, the Allied Air Force had created a wall of fire over the roads, making any German movement in daylight a suicide mission. The destroyer duel. Naval gunfire to the rescue. Back at Omaha, the situation was so dire that General Omar Bradley considered abandoning the beachhead. The infantry was pinned down behind a small shingle bank, unable to move. Seeing the crisis, Allied destroyers, at the risk of running aground, steamed into shallow waters, some coming within 800 yards of the shore. Without specific targets, the naval gunners watched for individual German muzzle flashes in the cliffs and fired point blank. This destroyer duel finally cracked the German concrete defenses. It gave the exhausted infantry the opening they needed to blow the shingle with Bangalore torpedoes and begin the slow, agonizing crawl up the bluffs. The bocage, the hedgerow hell. Those who survived the beaches soon realized that the French countryside was its own kind of fortress. This was the bocage, a landscape of small fields separated by ancient hedgerows. These weren't mere bushes, they were earthen walls 6 feet thick, topped with dense trees and brambles. To the Germans, the bocage was a gift. Every field was a natural kill zone. A single hidden anti-tank gun or sniper could hold up an entire battalion for hours. The Allied tanks, designed for open maneuver, were trapped. It would take a grassroots invention, the Rhino tank, fitted with scrap metal teeth, to literalize a breakthrough to solve the riddle of the hedges.
Medics and chaplains, the unarmed heroes. In the middle of the carnage, some of the bravest men carried no weapons at all. The combat medics of D-Day worked in the open, often using their own bodies to shield the wounded. On Omaha, medics had a casualty rate nearly as high as the frontline infantry. Chaplains, too, waded into the water, dragging drowning men to shore and providing comfort to those for whom the war was ending. These men were the moral glue of the invasion, proving that even in the height of total war, the instinct to save life remained as strong as the instinct to take it. The Mulberry B breakdown, the Great Storm. Just as the Allies began to consolidate their hold, nature struck back. On June 19, the worst Channel storm in 40 years hit the Normandy coast. The American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha was completely destroyed, and the British one at Armada was severely damaged. This was a logistical catastrophe. For 3 days, no supplies could land. If the Germans had been able to launch a major counterattack during this window, the Allied position would have been precarious. It forced the Allies to rely on beach-grounding LSTs, landing ship tanks, at low tide, a desperate measure that kept the liberation alive by a thread. The French resistance, the Shadow Army. D-Day was not just an outside job. Inside occupied France, the resistance went into overdrive. Triggered by coded messages broadcast by the BBC, such as lines from Verlaine's poetry, thousands of French citizens began sabotaging German infrastructure. They cut telephone lines, blew up rail tracks, and ambushed German reinforcements. This invisible front delayed the arrival of German divisions by days, giving the Allies the precious time they needed to turn a beachhead into a front line. The cost of the first 24 hours. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Allies had achieved the impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. But the cost was staggering. Over 4,400 Allied troops were confirmed dead, with thousands more wounded or missing. The Germans had lost somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 men. To reach the final 8,000-word target, we now move into the grueling campaign beyond the beaches. This final segment, chapters 21 through 30, covers the breakout, the strategic collapse of the German 7th Army, and the liberation of Paris, providing the deep technical and narrative detail required for a feature-length documentary. The logistics of victory, PLUTO and the Red Ball Express. A common military maxim states that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. D-Day would have been a footnote in history if the Allies couldn't sustain the men on the beach. 2 incredible feats of engineering made this possible. First was Operation PLUTO, a series of flexible fuel pipes laid across the floor of the English Channel to pump millions of gallons of gasoline directly from England to France. Second was the Red Ball Express. Because the French rail system had been destroyed by Allied bombing, the Army had to move on wheels. A massive convoy system was established, using 6,000 trucks on a one-way loop. At its peak, a truck was passing a given point every 15 seconds. Without this relentless flow of beans, bullets, and black oil, the Allied advance would have stalled before reaching the Seine.
The Battle for Caen, Montgomery's grinding war. While the Americans struggled in the hedgerows to the west, General Bernard Montgomery's British and Canadian forces faced the lion's share of German armor at Caen. Originally a D-Day objective, Caen didn't fall for 6 weeks. The Germans realized that if Caen broke, the road to Paris was open, so they concentrated their elite SS Panzer divisions there. The city was subjected to Operation Charnwood, one of the most controversial air bombardments of the war, which turned the historic city into a lunar landscape. The fighting was attritional in the truest sense, a slow, bloody grinding of men and machines that eventually exhausted the German reserves, setting the stage for the American breakout. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend. Fanatical, high-pitched shouting in German, the clatter of tank treads. Narrator. Facing the Canadians and British at Caen was one of the most fanatical units in the German order of battle, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Most of the soldiers were 17- and 18-year-old boys raised in the Nazi cult. They fought with a suicidal ferocity that shocked even the most hardened veterans. The battle between the Canadians and the 12th SS was particularly brutal, marked by war crimes on both sides and a refusal to take prisoners. The Hitlerjugend division was eventually decimated, but their resistance delayed the Allied timeline by nearly a month, proving that even a broken Reich could still bite with terrifying lethality. Operation Cobra, the Great Breakout. By late July, the stalemate had to be broken. General Omar Bradley conceived Operation Cobra. The plan was carpet bombing on a tactical scale, using 2,000 heavy bombers to blast a hole just 7 miles wide in the German front near Saint-Lô. The bombardment was so intense it actually killed hundreds of American soldiers due to short bombing, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. However, the effect on the Germans was paralyzing. The elite Panzer Lehr division was virtually vaporized. Through this gap, General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army poured into the open French countryside. The War of the Hedgerows was over. The War of Movement had begun. Patton's Third Army, the dash across France. George S. Patton was a polarizing figure, but he was the master of the blitzkrieg in reverse. Once the Third Army was unleashed, it covered more ground in less time than any army in history. Patton ignored his flanks, trusting his air cover, and raced toward the Seine. His philosophy was simple: hold him by the nose and kick him in the pants. The German command, still reeling from the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, was in total disarray. They had no answer for Patton's speed. The Atlantic Wall hadn't just been breached, it had been bypassed entirely. The Falaise pocket, the killing ground. By August, the German 7th Army was in full retreat, but they were being funneled into a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. The Allies closed the jaws from the north, Canadians and Polish, and from the south, Americans. The result was the Falaise pocket. What followed was an Allied turkey shoot. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in a corridor of fire. The carnage was so great that Allied pilots reported the smell of decaying flesh rising thousands of feet into the air. While some Germans escaped, they had to leave behind all their heavy equipment. The German army in the West had been broken as a coherent fighting force.
The liberation of Paris. On August 25, 1944, the symbolic heart of the resistance was reclaimed. Hitler had ordered the military governor of Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, to burn the city to the ground. "Is Paris burning?" Hitler famously screamed over the phone. Choltitz, realizing the war was lost and unwilling to destroy one of the world's most beautiful cities, defied the order. The French 2nd Armored Division was given the honor of entering the city first. The 4-year night and fog of Nazi occupation was over. The liberation of Paris was the emotional climax of the D-Day campaign. The intelligence war, Ultra, and the end of deception. Throughout the entire Normandy campaign, the Allies had a silent partner, Ultra. Thanks to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Eisenhower and Montgomery often knew German orders before the German generals did. They knew exactly when Hitler ordered the disastrous counterattack at Mortain, allowing American forces to set a trap. This God's-eye view of the battlefield shortened the war by months. D-Day was won with steel,
but it was guided by the quiet brilliance of mathematicians and linguists. The impact on the Eastern Front. It is a mistake to view D-Day in isolation. Just weeks after the landings, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed the German Army Group center. Hitler was now trapped in the nightmare he had always feared, a two-front war of attrition. The success of D-Day forced the German High Command to bleed the Eastern Front of its best divisions to try and hold the West. Every German tank destroyed in a French hedgerow was one less tank defending the road to Berlin. The giant pincers were finally closing. Conclusion: the legacy of the Crusade. D-Day was the moment the world's democratic powers proved they could project strength across an ocean to defeat tyranny. It was the Great Crusade, as Eisenhower called it. The invasion didn't just liberate France, it redefined the global order. We remember the 156,000 men who landed on those 5 beaches, not as distant historical figures, but as the architects of the world we inhabit today. Their sacrifice on the sands of Omaha, Juno, and Gold bought the freedom of the West. The longest day remains the ultimate testament to the power of human cooperation in the face of absolute evil.